morning. My name is Bob Wilbur. I'm the president of Stowe Conservation Trust. And I want to ask the trustees to stand up, if you would, just to identify so that people know it's a small town. And if everyone, so Janet Moffett, Eve Donahue, Carol Gumbart, Dick Perkins, Susan Crane, who else? Don Rising, John Sangermano, thank you. John, did I miss anyone? Oh, and Cliff. And Cliff Smith. Cliff is not feeling well tonight, so he's very sorry not to be here. Again, yes, let's give him a hand. So before we get started, I have two quick questions. Who made the lentil soup?
Great.
Excellent. And who made the eggplant parmesan? Really, really great. Both of those. Yeah, it's true. Our guest speaker, Gloriana Davenport, and her husband, Evan Schulman, are very good friends of mine. And so I coaxed them to come to Stowe, in part based on the promise of having really good food here. And we all know that that's a pretty easy promise to keep. The food is always delicious here. And so we're going to get started, and we're going to try to keep moving it along. And if you could go to the second slide. No, one right before that. There we go. Okay, so we had a meeting, the trust had a meeting with the Stew crew on Thursday night. So for the various members of the Stew crew, a little bit of apology because there's going to be some repetition in what I talked about with you folks on Thursday night. And you can tell by this image, and this was sent to me by our mutual good friend, Dwight Seipler. All right? He sent this to me on Thursday, and I said, that's perfect. I'm going to use that. And one of the reasons I love this image is because, it injects a little bit of humor on a very serious subject. And so I work at Mass Audubon, and because of that, I am apprised of the latest information on climate change, the latest science of climate change at any given moment. Sometimes I regret that, to be really honest with you. There are times where I really wish I didn't have the latest information on climate change. And so forgive me, especially while you're still finishing up your dinner, but I am going to be fairly serious here for a few minutes, and then we'll get on with the rest of the program, which will be mostly entertaining. But so there was an article that appeared, and some of you, I'm sure, read it. It was in the New York Times on November 8th. And the title was, How Scientists Got Climate Change So Wrong. And essentially what it says is that scientists as a group feel like they've let down society by not ringing the alarm early enough. And the reason for that is that scientists are trained to be skeptical, number one. They're also trained to be data-driven. And then third, they're also trained to work by consensus. And with climate change, the data has been slow in arriving, and the consensus has been disrupted by some efforts. I definitely don't want to make this a political talk, but some efforts to purposely confuse the dialogue. And in some cases, that was for profit reasons, to confuse the dialogue, and the dialogue of whether climate change existed, to be clear. And so it took a long time for the picture to clarify and crystallize as to exactly what is here now, and more importantly, what is coming in the reasonable distance future. And because of that delay, The reality is that the impacts are much greater than what was projected even about 5 years ago. And the entire thing is unfolding much faster. And that's a difficult twofer right there. And so, there was a letter that was signed by and released in the last week, was signed by more than 11,000 scientists. And some of the excerpts from that letter: scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat and tell it like it is. On the basis of this obligation and the graphical indicators presented below, we declare, with more than 11,000 scientist signatures from around the world, clearly and unequivocally, that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. The climate crisis has arrived and is accelerating faster than most scientists expected. It is more severe than anticipated, threatening natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity. And so I, as a fellow conservationist with all of you, I would be failing by not talking about that at this gathering, because one of the really important challenges right now is that not enough people realize what I just talked about. They're not aware of that. And we won't, as a group, commit to making the changes and taking the actions that are needed until we all understand the severity of what is going on. So, on a more positive note, but very much related, there was a report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that report confirms the important role that natural climate solutions will play in mitigating climate change. This new report is sobering. This is a quote from Andrew Bowman, who is the president of the Land Trust Alliance. The Land Trust Alliance is essentially the trade group for land trusts in the United States. 1,700 land trusts in the United States. Land trust movement began in Massachusetts in the 1890s. And so Andrew Bowman is the head of the umbrella organization for it. And he continues to say, the new report is sobering. It makes clear the absolutely essential role that land conservation will play in addressing the world's greatest environmental challenge. We can take comfort in knowing that we are in the right business at the right time. It is our responsibility to take our work to the next level of scale, effectiveness, and sustainability in a very short time. And so I share this with you for two reasons. One, for your own baseline information, and two, so that you realize that your Stowe Conservation Trust, your local land trust, has a critical role to play in responding to climate change. And so, Gloriana, if you could go to the next slide and see if you could get the video to play, that would be terrific.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about, but what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference,
Pretty cool, right?
but only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. We spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now when we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
Thank you, Gloria. Appreciate that very much. That's a very brave young Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg. So to finish on the subject and really just to drive home the point of natural climate solutions and how the Stowe Conservation Trust, the role that the lands that we protect will play in responding to climate change. The most obvious one is storage of carbon. So carbon, for those who may not know, carbon is the biggest single contributor to climate change. As carbon is released into the upper atmosphere, it causes essentially a blanket that keeps the heat in, and that causes the whole cascade of what we know as climate change. It goes beyond global warming, as that term went out about 5 years ago, and thankfully climate change became accepted as the more appropriate term. Global weirding was a term someone mentioned once, and it's kind of true. So storing carbon, keeping that carbon from being released, getting into the upper atmosphere is a really very powerful service that our forests play in particular. The Stowe Conservation Trust has protected a lot of forests here in the town of Stowe and will continue doing that. And so those places will keep that carbon locked up. Those trees also sequester carbon. And so this is probably a good point to point out the distinction. Storage is what I just talked about. It keeps it locked up in the actual woody mass of the tree, the trunk and roots and soil. Sequestration is, think of that as absorbing the carbon CO2 that's in the air, that's been released by things like cars and power plants and so on. Trees absorb up to 15% of those emissions. So you think about how powerful the service is that a tree provides, both storing the carbon and absorbing 15% of the gases that we spew out that will cause additional climate change otherwise. protecting land can be very powerful in terms of storing floodwaters, and the Trust has been doing that for a very long time. The land that we protected in the Heath Hen Meadow is a great example of that, and an even better one is all the land that we protected along the Assabet, including Don and Marcia Rising's very generous gift. Another one is that forests, especially filtering clean water, very powerful. And then last, and I should have mentioned this when I talked about the absorption of carbon, the sequestration of carbon by trees. What they take in the carbon, what do they put back out? Oxygen, air, life-sustaining air for all of us. So the reference to a tree being an amazing machine is not far off at all. And so we are going to be stepping up our efforts to be involved with protecting lands that have great climate change response services for all of us in addition to nature. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, please. So that's the serious part, so you can all take a breath and say, thank goodness he's done with that. But hopefully that was helpful for you to have a better handle on what's going on. This is the ultimate environmental issue that we're ever going to see. Our lifetimes, our kids' lifetimes, their kids' lifetimes. But we've had a wonderful Bike for the Woods in 2019, another great one, and we can all thank Chris Spear for that. Let's give Chris a hand. He's done that for many years, and it's been a great event and continues to be a great event for the Trust. Let's see, let me talk about stewardship for a few minutes here. Pardon me. So with the thanks of John San Germano is leading our fee stewardship efforts and really been doing a great job with it. Our Stew Crew, which for anyone who doesn't know, the Stew Crew is the name that we've given to the small army of volunteers who advance stewardship of the Stowe Conservation Trust lands, and been very, very effective and very essential, actually. And so going back to climate change for a moment, one of the things, it's not just about protecting lands, it's not just about conserving and preventing development. It's about the stewardship that takes place after land is acquired, because there are things like invasive plants that some of which are migrating in from the south as the climate changes. And many of those invasive plants do not have natural predators because they frankly aren't supposed to be here. And because of that, they can grow unchecked and can really do tremendous damage to an ecosystem. In climate change, climate science jargon, they're known as stressors. And so climate change itself is the ultimate stressor, putting huge stress on nature, ecosystems. And so anything we can do to reduce other stressors can help nature be more resilient as the impacts of climate change set in. So responding to invasive plants is a really powerful one. And so the Stew Crew has been very involved with pulling garlic mustard on the Leggett property, Japanese knotweed, digging and pulling also at the Leggett property, bittersweet pulling at Fieldstone, water chestnut pulling at the Fresha Pond, a conservation restriction, and burning bush removal on the Kaluzdian property. So all of those are very, very important activities that will help the nature on our properties remain more resilient to the impacts of climate change. One of the things that we hope to do in 2020 is to be able to launch a mapping project to do a comprehensive inventory of all invasive plant outbreaks on trust lands throughout the town, to map those, to investigate the most appropriate treatment prescription for those plant species, and then begin addressing them, because again, that has particular relevance to help those forests and fields and meadows be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. The Stew Crew is also very much involved with maintaining trails. Last winter, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, we had some very heavy snow storms and a lot of tree damage. And so there was one point where almost every trail in town was impassable. And thanks to the Stew Crew for getting out there and getting those trails opened up again. Also very much involved in trail marking, signage, and maintenance of boardwalks and so on. So this is work that is easy to take for granted. You don't often see it. They're out there during the difficult weather making those improvements, while some of us have our feet up by the wood stove. But it's really important work, and we really appreciate that very much. Let's have a hand for the Stew Crew. Okay, if you could go to the next slide. All right, so the Trust is continuing in our effort to protect important lands in Stowe, including farms. This community, agriculture is a big part of our heritage, and we had, thanks to all of you and everyone else in this community, we were able to protect two of the most iconic farms in town in the last couple of years, and those being Carver Hill Orchard and Small Farm. That was no small undertaking. It was in partnership with the town of Stowe, and those properties are both now permanently protected. We've also made progress for many years, actually, protecting farms. And just last week, the Trust committed to providing the town match, the local match, for an agricultural preservation restriction that's going to be going on another parcel of the Applefield Farm property. So that will be happening in the next 6 to 9 months, and we're excited about that. We have a number of projects in the works, but those are the ones that we can talk about publicly at this point. So you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so maybe I have covered that part of it. So the next thing I would like to do is announce the, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to do. How did you know that? So this is to announce that tomorrow is the grand opening of the new trail at the Leggett Woods nature area. And Janet, what are we calling it?
Forest Tales. Well, it's Nature Discovery Trail.
Thank you.
So the goal is to have younger kids get outside with their parents, enjoy being outside. This one here, you can see the sculpture in the photo. It's about 6 inches tall, affixed to rocks, thanks to the Stew Crew, and actually thanks us to Montenegro Landscaping and Lombardo Loam for help on putting down cloth and wood chips and clearing out the area. So we've got rocks were cleared out. Stew Crew helped spread the wood chips, and then the sculptures are now going to be available to walk the path off to the side. And the sculptures are by Linda Hoffman. And we should also thank the Alice Eaton Fund for supporting financial support on it as well.
So I want to make sure the TV heard the last part. The Alice Eaton Fund, which is unfortunately phasing out their gift giving, and they've been very good to Stowe for many years. And there were 2 grants, I believe, that were made to this particular project. And while I'm at it, 3 grants, thank you for correcting me. And while I'm at it, I want to appreciate Janet and Carol Gumber for both of their efforts with this project. This is a very creative idea of creating a trail that's more inviting to younger people, I mean really young people, and having a place that is filled with wonder and not as much risk of things like ticks, purposely having the trails be more free of things like ticks. So good job, and it's great to see that. Okay, the next thing I would like to do is to, if you could just go to the next one, which is dark right there. The winner of you could go to the next one. The Conservation Award for 2019 is Bill Wrigley. And Bill was sorry he couldn't be here tonight. He's the town administrator, for anybody who doesn't know. He has been the town administrator in Stowe for 28 years. And he is going to be retiring before our next annual meeting. And we wanted to make sure to take a moment to appreciate him. And so before I read what his citation says, I just want to say a few personal words, which is that in my job at Mass Audubon, I get a chance, it's a statewide organization, I get a chance to go into a lot of town halls and town buildings across the state, probably 300 of the 351 at this point. And I've met a lot of town managers or town administrators, same thing, it's the same, just depends which title they want to use. Believe me, we've been very fortunate to have a really good one for a really long period of time. Bill is a very level-headed thinker, and he also recognizes something that is good for the community when he sees it. An example of that for me was the Community Preservation Act. It would be inappropriate for him to be out there advocating for something. That's not what that job is. He would anger some people in the community if he did that. But trust me, after every single important conservation milestone, things like protecting Carver Hill and Small Farm, I got a phone call or an email from Bill congratulating and acknowledging the importance of it. So this is what it will say: in recognition of his more than 28 years of dedicated service as town administrator for the town of Stowe, providing fiscal stability and fostering thoughtful, even-keeled judgment during Bill's tenure, and with his oversight, many important conservation achievements occurred, including Stowe's early adoption of the Community Preservation Act, the establishment of Stowe Community Park and Town Center Park, the permanent protection of the Flag Hill landscape, Red Acre Woodlands, Shepherd Memorial Woodland, multiple farms as part of the Stowe Conservation Trust Save Stowe's Farms initiative, and many other important lands protected throughout Stowe. So let's have a hand for Bill Wrigley. Thank you, Bill. Okay, then we'll go to the next one. I'm feeling strangely, okay, I think, so we're up to, this is the point where I introduce our speaker. And so let me just say that the project that you're about to hear about was one that I was very much involved with. I was very fortunate to be very involved with this. This is, put very simply, this is one of the coolest projects I've ever been involved with. This is a dandy. You guys are going to love this. And I would say this if they weren't sitting here. Gloriana Davenport and Evan Schulman are two of the really great people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know in my time on this planet, really and truly. So I will not or maybe I should read your bio. I should not. Okay, then let me just say that. She was one of the founders of the Media Lab at MIT, just to give you a little bit of idea. So this is somebody who's not a small thinker, okay? This is somebody, big ideas. And as I usually say to people, the two of them, not only big thinkers, but doers. And those two things don't always go together. It's a rare one when they go together. And so if you could press the next couple so that all the different players. This is about the Tidmarsh property in Plymouth, which was a 600-acre, if you could pause right there just for a moment. Actually, I'll talk about this very quickly. So Evan and Gloriana on the right, and then in the middle, essentially, is a brilliant guy, a mutual friend of ours named Alex Hackman. Alex works for the State Division of Ecological Restoration. We're going to hear a lot about him, so I won't continue on him. And then on the left is David Gould. David Gould is works for the town of Plymouth, and all of them were just tremendous partners to work with. If you go to the next one. So pause there for a second. This is when I first saw this property, which was in about 2010. They invited me down through one of our board members, a mutual friend of Evan, old friend of Evan, old work colleague of Evan. And they said they have a 600-acre cranberry farm, and they want to do something really interesting with it. Why don't you come down and take a look and hear what they have to say? And so I looked at that, and what it is, this is a very large cranberry farm. So Evan was a very effective cranberry farmer. He acquired 3 or 4 farms. That's why it's Tidmarsh Farms with an S. Knitted them together and created a very large cranberry operation. The Ocean Spray Cooperative, at the time, and it probably still is, the largest producer of cranberries in the world. At its peak, Tidmarsh Farm produced 1 out of 100 of all the cranberries produced by Ocean Spray. And so that may not sound significant, but if you really think about everything I just said, that's a lot of cranberries. And so I went back, and they described to me what they wanted to do. So let me say it this way. I learned that cranberry farms in Massachusetts were located in places that were very special places in nature, places with lots of cold, pristine water, interesting wetland systems. And so prior to cranberry farming, in other words, prior to about 1880, this was a place with very diverse wetland systems, cold water stream, marshes, fens, and so on. Very special place in nature. And so what they wanted to do, and they talked with Evan's children, and they said, do any of you want to be cranberry farmers? And they said, I don't think so. But what they wanted to do was do right by the land and restore it to what it once was. Now there's one of your big thoughts right there. I just mentioned the big thoughts. That's a big, gigantic, humongous thought. And so I thought that was very interesting, and went back to our board of directors, if you go to the next one, and I described it to them and said, I think we should buy this land. And that's about what the responses I got back from them is, so why would we want to do that? Well, I said, let me count the reasons. And then we go to the next one. One of the reasons is that what they wanted to do on the property was on the cover of Scientific American. That's how significant it was. And it had to do with an embedded sensor network in this property. Again, going back to MIT, really amazing things. Next, please. For me, the biggest attraction for this project was the fact that it showcased the concept of resilience, such an important concept, especially in terms of responding to climate change. It had all of the different strategies showcased for any of the visitors. And so, next slide. Look at, and I'm going to give you just a little peek of some of the results of this restoration. So this was the largest freshwater wetland restoration ever in the history of the Northeast United States. That's a big deal, really big deal. So this dam, that dam was 14, if you go back one more time, I just want to get people oriented. Look at the pine trees on the horizon for your reference. That dam, which was about 14 feet high, concrete, was taken out so the water could flow freely, making it more resilient, restoring the form and function of natural systems. And look what resulted. Absolutely incredible. Go to the next one. Look at this. This was the pond that was being held back by that dam. All cranberry bogs have a reservoir. That was the reservoir that was held back behind. So look at the dates, summer 2010, next. A year late, not even a year later, what you see are stumps from Atlantic white cedar trees that were once there. And more importantly, what you see, if you go back, what you see is the meandering cold water stream that's been underwater for 100 years. And that gave the engineers who were designing the restoration a better handle on how that stream should be redesigned and recreated. Next. A year later, you see the grasses starting to come back in, and then a year later, beautiful cattail marsh, and that's what it is today. So this restoration put this property on a trajectory of change that is really unlike any other property. Most conservation areas, it's about protecting what's there now so that I can go back, my kids can go back and see that same, experience that same thing. Tidmarsh is very, very different. It's about, it will be a dynamic system changing for hundreds of years until it gets back to a steady state again. And we can thank Evan and Gloriana for that. So next slide. And there they are. And that's on the property in Evan's vintage 1937. Is it 37? I got it right. I got it right. 1937 MG. Absolutely a beauty. And that was on the property. So without further ado, I want to introduce two of my really great friends. And I'm really pleased that they're here to present to all of you tonight. Gloriana Davenport.
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
That was a great intro. You got to see some little images of the property that you may not see again, but you'll hear about all of them. Bob, who's become a very good friend over many years of introducing him to the property and then negotiating with him and then trying to figure out how you transfer a property like this, which is no small feat. You know, there were 3 barns all filled with different stuff. There were different houses. There were, but he was really solid through everything and sort of held our hand when we needed our hand held. And the rest of the time, I guess I can say, stayed out of the way because he was too busy doing other things. So it was really a pleasure working with him. And thank you so much for inviting us here tonight, because we really, love our story in some sense, and we're trying to continue to expand it. And we love telling other people about it and getting them excited about sort of the underlying ideas and principles of what we're doing. So the idea is that I'm going to talk a little bit about the owner's journey. The owner's journey was very long and lugubrious. It took us almost 10 years to do this project up till now, and it's not done, but it's not our problem anymore. So I'm going to talk a little, I'm going to set this up a little bit by circling back to some of the things that Bob was mentioning about climate change. It's a tough subject, but I think that this should all give people a little uptick. Talk about the making of Tidmarsh Farms, which of course happened in the, do I need to get that closer? Is it okay? So talk a little bit about the making of Tidmarsh Farms, which of course happened also over many, many years, and then a little bit about the restoration effort and conservation effort that took place, and a little bit about a nonprofit we founded to go along with the restoration, and in particular to offer some recommendations of, if you do get involved with restoration, what you might think about as being important to track. So what I want to talk about in, just to set this up and to circle back to some of what Bob's talked about, there's an organization that was founded as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that Bob talked about. I think it was first organized in France, but it is now around the world. It's called 4P1000. You know, you can't even figure out what that means. But the idea is that if we're able to increase soil organic matter in all farm land and degraded land around the world by just 4 parts per 1,000, in the top 30 centimeters of the land surface, we could significantly mitigate anthropological emissions and stabilize the climate over a 30-year period, and that's a pretty big goal. I have seen other stats that say 1% of soil carbon, so it means that if you're just growing a garden, don't let that soil get depleted. Keep putting in that organic matter. Of course, if you're growing a garden and growing tomatoes, you know that, because you can't grow good tomatoes if you don't constantly increase the soil. But it means forest land, it means grassland for birds, it means all kinds of different habitat where you're adding carbon materials into the soils. And while the other thing I want to say about this is I don't believe that that can be blanketly legislated. Not all degraded lands are the same. These decisions are made by people. They're made by farmers. They're made by conservation trusts. They're made by all kinds of different people. But the decisions have to be adapted based on local, environmental, social, and economic situations. And they can also involve technology, which is very important. Technology is going to change the game in climate. Whether it succeeds or it doesn't succeed, there are a lot of people worried about it, and there are a lot of people working on new technologies for it. So I want people to feel a little more upbeat than what the New York Times would like you to feel, which is, God, we're in the middle of this terrible thing. And you know what young people feel? They can't do anything about it because nobody's talking about the positive things that you can do. Of course, some people are, so. And the other thing I wanted to say is it's all about learning. We all love to learn, and I had a wonderful run at the Media Lab and at MIT for 30 years, and I love being around young people learning, and I love being around faculty who were learning, and I just think that sometimes we don't talk about how much we learn and how much that's a part and a fun part of the journey. So, you know, when you go out and clear a trail, maybe you learn about a plant you didn't know because the person next to you knows what that plant is. And the journey that Evan and I took, both in the farming side, which I was a little less involved in because I was flying around the world for MIT, but certainly in the conservation and restoration piece, we didn't know anything going in. And we had to learn fast, and we had to learn from a lot of people, and that was part of the fun too. Southeastern Mass, which is where this project is, it's in Plymouth, Mass, is a little bit different from Stowe. specifically in the landscape. The landscape was formed by the glacial retreat about 12,000 years ago. Very sandy, gravelly. It has huge glacial erratics as part of it. But it also has kettle holes. Kettle holes were made when chunks of ice broke off of the glacier as it was retreating, got covered by sediment, and made big divots in the landscape as the landscape built up. And some of them filled with water to make beautiful ponds, some of which don't have any input or output. They're just filled with water. And some of them filled up with peat. And peat is a very special ecotype. This map shows you the peatland. That's all that dark brown all over. Doesn't even show any being on Cape Cod. But almost all cranberry bogs in Cape Cod were built on clearing, deforesting, ditching, flattening, and damming a peat landscape. And I just thought that I would just start this with a very special person who visited Eel River. Eel River was the first cranberry property that was restored, and we as owners were very lucky to be able to visit that when we were trying to make our decision what to do, because we didn't know what restoration meant in the case of a cranberry farm. And this is the Lynn Rochefort. She is the #1 expert on restoring peatlands in Canada. Peat moss, which many of you know, comes in big bags. It's harvested. It's cut peat. It's cut sphagnum moss that is then dried and put into packages so you can put it in your garden. And she came to visit. This was very exciting. It was year 7 after Eel had been restored. And the one thing she told us is, she said, I didn't do the study, so I can't tell you for sure, but I think that you are carbon positive now, which means that we are sequestering carbon. So you don't sequester carbon the first year or the second year or the third year, but the sphagnum is like this deep. Unbelievable. And let me see if I can get my...
And that plant is what we call an ecosystem engineer. It creates its own environment. And that's why that once you start to have it in the system, it will start to take control. Because for 2-3 things. It draws the water, so it keeps the environment wet. So the vascular plants slowly don't like it as much because the feed is wet. So that. Plus it produces a lot of acid. It acidifies the environment. Okay. So the plant can, and then again, it's hard for the other plants when it becomes too acid.
Yeah. Can it become a bit like a bit of filter? Act as a filter?
Very much so. Very much so. There's a very high cation exchange capacity on the cell wall of these things. And that's why it's an important ecosystem on the planet, because it helps right now, like with the area of peatland there is on the planet, cool down, if you want, by 25% of the planet. You get rid of all the peatlands, you would warm up. The forcing would be 25% warmer. You know, so it's why it's one of the reasons the peat industry or Canada wants to really make sure this plant grows back.
Okay, that's also my filming. But did you hear what the point is? If you got rid of all the peatlands in the world, the planet would warm by 25%. I mean, the climate, lots of things affect the climate, is part of my point. Complexity affects the climate. Peatlands are something we really want to save and protect. The last thing I want to say before I'm going to get much more specific about the land itself is we couldn't have done this without a lot of partners. When we closed with Mass Audubon and the town of Plymouth in 2017, we had 22 partners. So you don't go on a project like this alone, and thank you to Mass Audubon, the town of Plymouth, especially thanks to Division of Ecological Restoration in Massachusetts, and the USDA Natural Conservation Services, Natural Resource Conservation Services, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But there were many others, many of the universities, etc., and we'll get into some specifics. So, on to Tidmarsh Farms. I hope that this will be fun. So, I'm going to first talk about our land, which is, you see on the map right there. The watershed is about 4.2 square miles. The farm is 177 acres of cranberry bogs. There's a main road that goes between those two red outlines you see, and we divided that into, for our purposes, Tidmarsh East and Tidmarsh West.
The watershed boundary is shown in blue, the property is outlined in gray.
The water coming into the property is from Fresh Pond. It's a deep kettle hole pond from the arm from Beaver Dam Pond, which was that reservoir that Bob showed you, from Great Island Pond, and all of that water flows north through the bogs, which means that the river always wants to take away its own. Very hard to farm with a river running through it. Up north through Bartlett Pond, which you can tell is very developed right up there on the coast if you look and see how many houses there are, out to the ocean. And Evan acquired these farms. Why? He claims he had an irresistible urge to farm because his mother farmed, his brother farmed, his sister farmed, all in Canada. And he had 3 children. He was divorced. He was growing up 3 children in Boston. He was playing in the financial industry, and he wanted a farm that was within an hour's drive of Boston, that was profitable, that didn't have high labor needs, and probably some other things. He had a client. The client said, "Oh, I have a cranberry farm. I know exactly what you want to do. Cranberries." So Evan went out looking for cranberry land, and he has some very funny stories to tell about sitting with farmers and trying to figure out, would they come up with a price? And finally, he would come up with a price, at which point they would close the deal. They'd say, "Never mind, walk away," and their property was valued at the price whatever Evan offered. So anyway, it took him a while. I actually met him in '84, just as he bought the second farm. Cranberries are sort of a funny plant. They are a small vine, fruiting vine. You may have seen them. They like, the hair root of the vine likes to grow in sand that is moist, but not too wet or all the berries rot. But the taproot likes to grow in water, or likes to reach water. And they like very acidic soils, and they used to be used by the early settlers against scurvy, because they have a very high vitamin C. You know, pop one in your mouth and it goes whoop. So, it's an iconic crop in Massachusetts. Everybody sort of knows the picture of all those red berries floating on the water at harvest time. And it was a very big industry, and we'll return in a minute to a very high level to that. But first, I just want to say something about farming in general, which is so cool. Farming doesn't sit still. Farming is about innovation as much as it's about hard work and innovation. And it's hard to grow monocultures, so the technology has to improve. On the left, you see all the hand picking that went on. On the right, you see modern farming techniques. They flood the bog about 4 inches. They take a picker, knock off those berries. Then they flood the bog some more, and they rope off the berries with some, well, it changed in my time. It used to be 2x4s that were hinged together, and now it's material that is used to contain big oil slicks. And they put a pump down there, and you pump into a semi-tractor trailer. In order to put on sand, which you have to apply every 3 years, well, in the old days, they used to have sand buggies. Well, in the old days, they actually had people and mules. After that, they had sand buggies. They'd flood the bogs for the winter flood, and they'd freeze because it was cold. But the last few years, it hasn't been cold, so the end of our farming period, we were using these big sand barges. If you have a monoculture, you have tons and tons and tons of berries. They all need to have a bee touch them. And so you truck bees from Florida up to Canada, back down to Massachusetts or across the country. Not very good for the bees, as we've discovered. You also have a ton of bugs, and the bugs increase on an annual basis. They give you a little book. Ocean Spray gives you a little book like this, a little flip book. There are about 150 different bugs that hit the cranberry crop. And if one of them starts to grow, they have very fast cycles. One of them starts to grow, you can wipe out 2 or 3 bogs of the crop in days. So you're right on it with things that are not very good for the environment. And this I put in because I wanted to show you how we farmed. This is our eastern farm, the Mass Audubon property, from a helicopter shot. Then you see the helicopter. The helicopter is lifting sand from ditches. Helicopter's also used to put on fertilizer. It's also used to spray for bugs if the bugs get bad. So a couple of things. You have to have a helicopter operator handy, and he has to be able to come pronto. We also had a big weedy machine because we had a river. We were putting on chemicals. You get a lot of weeds in the river. This is the not so nice part of cranberry farming, but it's all about trying to get 32,000 barrels of cranberries in 1 year. That was 1% of Ocean Spray's crop. And it was never going to happen again. Not because necessarily we didn't want it to, but here we go. So, you've all heard of disruptive technology. Disruptive technology in farming is a better cultivar that produces 5 times as many berries. So you can grow on a quarter of the amount of land, you can grow the same number of berries. And wonderful irrigation systems that run from computers. Sounds great, right? Put them right in. Very expensive to put them in a wetland bog, but you can put them on an upland bog. Uplands in Massachusetts are very expensive. So you go to Wisconsin and Cranberry and Canada, which is where many of the berries that are grown today are. And it's why growers are leaving Massachusetts at a huge rate, and it's a big problem. But even before those berries were starting to come into Ocean Spray, the prices were starting to get very unstable. We had 3 kids that each of them got married. They had children of their own. They were living other places. They didn't want to farm. There were almost no young farmers who were coming up. So we tried to figure out what to do with the land starting around, we probably made the decision around 2006. I left MIT in 2008 to manage the project and see the kids really wanted, if we could keep 610 acres protected, could you do it? Let's give it a shot. So as I mentioned, we were very lucky to have Eel River. Because for owners, we were talking to the USDA. Let me back up. USDA, the Department of Agriculture. They keep a little money aside, and it goes to this Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they keep that money aside to pay farmers to take land out of production when they either want to take it out of production for 10 years or in perpetuity. And that's a great thing, and it's thanks to your tax dollars. So they can help farmers that get in a bad position, or they can just, if you don't want to farm anymore. So we were talking to them. They wanted to put an easement on that was for conservation and restoration. We didn't know what restoration meant, and they weren't going to tell us. So, but luckily we had Eel River right there, and we went and saw what it was doing, and we thought, maybe we can do that. And the same time we were talking to them, we met this incredible guy, Alex Hackman, who worked for the state, who went out walking the property with me the first day, and there was a baby carriage. People threw all kind of stuff on our property. I mean, king-size mattresses got thrown on our property. Television sets by the dozens got thrown on the property. Really tough for a landowner. You got to clean that up. And I couldn't get this baby carriage out of one of the waterways. And he said, never mind, I'll go get it out. Jumped down, pulled it up, and I said, this guy is enthusiastic and he can manage this property. He can sell this idea to raise the money to do the restoration, which was going to cost some money. So we started. We took the eastern bogs out of production in 2010. We drew down the reservoir. Bob showed you some great pictures of the stumps in the reservoir. I wanted to do that right away because there's a little nasty thing, which is if you have a dam, and ours was a state dam, it was possible if people really didn't want us to do the project we were doing, that they would try to make it a historic structure. And if it would be a historic structure, we would not have been able to do a restoration easily. We'd have needed much more fire power. So we drew it down. We only had one group of people really complain who had bought houses on another development adjacent to that reservoir and thought they had bought a kettle pond view. So they didn't think it would ever go down. But anyway, they complained a lot. We had to go to the Concom. But at the end of the day, I think that they're pretty happy with the result. And in 2011, we applied and became a priority project for the state. That is also very important. When you're a priority project for the state, they can't let you go until they're done. And being done in restoration means that not only the east side had to be done, but the west side had to be done. And I didn't know I didn't know we'd have other owners. So I was like, I don't want to start this project and get it half done. So anyway, 2017, the good news is both the town of Plymouth and Mass Audubon, about a few months between the two sales, purchased at discount, but they purchased the land. This meant that the children were out of the land, which was a very good solution for us. We didn't have to have them solve it after we were gone, which is, I think, a big problem for many of us, and some of us have been through that. So, what is restoration? Ecological restoration, according to the Society for Ecological Restoration, made this definition that it is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. This can be a blacktop that you put in and you want to take away, or it could be a farm that has come out of production where you want to, where it was once forested, or it could be many things. But the big part of it is the assisted, because the assisted means you don't decide exactly what it's going to look like. You try to assist, you try to take off those stressors Bob was talking about, those natural stressors. And one of the fun things about this project is, in order to even think about what should it look like, where should we go with it, and by the way, Evan always had a good line. He always said, restore for the future. Don't try to restore to what it was. You can't do that. We're way too down the path with the human society. But you can go to these old atlases, and the fun part was, on the left side, you see that the there's Bartlett Brook, and then there's a very thin channel, and then you sort of get that fat channel back on our side, on the eastern side, so where that piece comes down. Yeah. So what we discovered was in the early 1800s, there was a mill there. There was a dam actually at 3A, right where that thin streamline goes to the sort of fat part that's on our property. And they made colored threads for fishermen so that if the fisherman broke the net, he could tell which thread broke. So brilliant. Why don't they still do that? So cool. Anyway, that mill went away. And by 1885, you can see there's the Pine Hill Bog Company, owned by Sampson and Snell, and then you can see the Manamet Cranberry Bog Company, which ultimately one of the owners became one of the founders of Ocean Spray, and that's the property that Mass Audubon now owns. But I love these pictures because it also shows, for instance, it clarifies to you that it was a swamp. It was a wetland swamp. And so that's some of the sort of fun things that we do. But the goal was to establish conditions to encourage development of a complex, dynamic, adaptive, and self-sustaining wetland. That's what we wanted to do. The way that you do that is that you restore the physical processes for the movement and storage of water. That means that you have to take out all the dams. Cranberry bogs are built with lots of dams, and part of it is so there's road passageways. Bob showed you one of the big ones, which I thank him for because I just took that out of this presentation earlier today. You want to restore landscape connectivity because you want the critters to be able to move through the landscape. And you want to create conditions for diverse communities and habitats. And one of the things that we did there was we put, you'll see it in a minute, put chunks of large wood all over. Because in the beginning you have no trees, so you want to create shade for the little critters. And this shows you, so instead of, I'm just going to go over here for a minute. You see the sinuous channel up there. That's 3.5 miles of new stream channel. And you can see right next to it sort of a straight line of where the old channel went. And so the difference is that when you're a farmer, you want to get water on and off that landscape as fast as you can. So you want to get it on from the reservoir, and then if you're harvesting, all the bogs were built dams, so you let the water, get the water on the first bog, then you're ready to harvest the next bog, then you're ready to harvest the next bog, but you don't want it to take a lot of time. So get that channel really straight and you can move the water. If you want habitat, and if you want water storage, and you want plants to be filtering water, you want a sinuous channel, you want to move the water slowly. So this was a big change for the landscape, and that's why, as Bob said, it's going to take hundreds of years to get it to its final state. Very quickly, 2015 was go time for us. The scientists love this, by the way, because there's a time all these trucks come on the land, they change everything. If you've been looking before, then you get to look after, and you have a period where you have very rapid change. So it was fun. You see the sinuous channel. This is what Bob showed the other reverse view of this. But
Remember the hard cranberry bog.
Mm-hmm. That's it right there. And that's the output from the former reservoir. And this is one of my favorite shots because this was obviously taken with a drone, but you can actually see the pieces of large wood that were spread across the landscape. And you can also really get a sense of how tightly those river bends were. And we have Mother Nature, but we also need Father Time. So we always like William Mitch's articulation of this, that it's not going to be the day those trucks leave that it's all done. It will be hundreds of years from now. And that's why it was so terrific that Mass Audubon also stepped up to the plate and said, we're okay protecting a piece of land where it's going to change for 100 years. And so today this sanctuary is evolving. And I was just out on the bog surface 2 weeks ago, and we have sphagnum. And what I want is more sphagnum, and it's coming up onto all the rushes, and it's coming up around the trees. So right now you walk out, and sometimes you're in a pillow like about this. But Eel River, you're in a pillow like this. So that's what we'd like, the pillow like this. But we're getting there. So, 5 more minutes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Oh, well, I'm about to do the...
But just very quickly, one of the things that was so great about this project, that Gloriana mentioned the need to deposit sand every 3 years for cranberry farming. So imagine that over 120 years. That's a lot of sand.
It's 2 feet of sand across the whole peat bog surface.
So the idea of physically removing 2 feet of sand over 600 acres was impossible. So you could never do that. So they didn't do that. They solved that by using large logs. There was one point where they had a stack of mature trees with the root balls, thousands of them. They collected them for about 2 years from all over southeastern Massachusetts. Every construction site brought their trees to Tidmarsh. I mean, it was the biggest pile you can't even imagine. So they deposited the trees down to back up the flow of water, to raise the profile of the moisture in the soil, to overcome that 2 feet of sand.
Actually,
And-
can I?
Yep, please.
Actually, the wood didn't do that.
Didn't.
But we did build riffles. We built 2 riffles, and that's what Bob's talking about, and that's important in the stream channel.
And
But we also filled all of the ditches. That also raised the water level.
Yeah. And the vegetation that you now look at there, where did that come from?
Well, then we did microtopography. So the sand layer was a big piece. Bob's absolutely right. We'll get to it in a different way around in a minute. But because you couldn't remove it, the excavators made divots in it. Basically big mounds, we planted 8,000 Atlantic white cedar that were grown on site. And when they're making this divot, they can get down to the peat. So you have little bits of peat that are open, and that's where you hope the sphagnum will come and start to reproduce. And what did you ask?
The vast majority of the vegetation
Is seed bank. So by breaking up the cranberry mat, you're opening up the seed bank. And then we planted about 30,000 plants, which is nothing for this size. And the herring started to run again. So the other good news is that I think over 300 bird species have been documented as being there now. Obviously, we got a lot more wetland type of birds, migrating shorebirds, many different kinds. The river herring are running. We have 2 rare-ish turtles. And the first season that they were open, the estimate is they had 40,000 visitors, which is why I didn't want to run a publicly accessible sanctuary. But that's an incredible, so the goal of making this public was a very important part of the whole thing, but it waited till the very end. While we were going through the process, we tried to keep people off as much as possible. So I just want to say a little bit about Living Observatory because it's a very important part of it, and it's a very, I think it was a critical part of raising the funding to do this, both from the state and the federal government. $1 billion every year is invested in restoration projects, federal and state money, in the US. A tiny fraction, I would say, way less than 1%, maybe 0.1%, is for pre-monitoring, and almost nothing is for post-monitoring. If there's any post-monitoring, it's for 3 years. A project like this, you're not even sequestering carbon, really, for 7 years. So the idea of Living Observatory is, could we document the long-term trajectory of this project, starting with this project? Could we create a community to do that, and a community that shared data? And the sharing of data is very not so usual also. Everybody wants to do their own study, and their study is approved, and they go off and do their study, and the next person is doing a study, they don't have the data that the other person had. So we really wanted this to have shared data involved. And then, so we sort of formed this sort of loosely, and then we finally incorporated as a nonprofit because we, through our discussions with Mass Audubon, realized we were going to have to make collaborative agreements with property owners, and that we couldn't do as a sort of a loosely organized group of people. But we hold summits that bring all the stakeholders together. And we also are doing an increasing number of projects that involve outreach. So one of our partners has schools in Africa, India, Hawaii, New York City, blah, blah, blah. But they're all about sustainable agriculture. And the idea of that is to look at how we learned, what we learn about water, what we learn about carbon sequestration, what we learn about soil, and be able to share that with children who are working on how are they going to solve some really tough problems in far-off places of the world. Mass Audubon, of course, has a wonderful education program for locally focused in Massachusetts, but we are very global in our reach. We want to know, how does restoration affect water quality? We also want to know, what about soils? Now, this is to me the great takeaway of Living Observatory. If you walk away from your cranberry bog, it will grow up. It will look like upland forest with ditches running through it. In 100 years, you might get to 20% wetland function. If you restore, the early research says, in 50 years, you might get to 85% wetland function. Wetland function is carbon storage, carbon sequestration. So it's a big deal, but it's never been documented before, so nobody knows. We did a lot with plants. We have a native plant nursery. We really believe that you should collect seeds for these projects so that the seeds are locally gathered. We've done a lot of work on river herring, looking at the exchange of energy between wetland and freshwater, which is important for these particular fish species. And Bob alluded to this networked sensory landscape, which became an article in Scientific American. I came out of the media lab. One of my colleagues, I went to him when I started this. He was working on a virtual structure of the laboratory, and I said, well, why don't we build a virtual structure of a restored landscape? And then we might be able to make a game where you sort of could play in the different levels of the wetland. So we're still working on that. So these are sensors that were developed at MIT. Brian Mayton is about to defend his PhD. He has about 200 sensors out on the landscape and about 30 microphones, and I don't know, I can't remember, 6 or 8 cameras. And he measures all kinds of things. One of the big questions here is, did we make the site wet? What does that even mean? Soil moisture, we want to know about soil moisture. What happens to soil moisture on a hummock? How quickly do those hummocks dry out? So that shows some of his microphones. You can go to the website and see a lot of the sensor data. So this is at tidmarsh.media.mit.edu. There are many other such things, but this idea is that so we have two sort of focuses. One is what can you look at from your home? How can you connect with nature at home or in a pod? Connecting with nature is very important to health and well-being and all those things. But then also, how might you experience nature a little differently? And so we have the idea that you're in nature and you might be wearing a headset. And this headset was designed by Gershon Dublin at the lab. He did his PhD on it, and I'll just play a little bit of.
As I move my head, I go from hearing the tree birds, and now I'm hearing more ducks and geese, and I put on my supersonic beam action.
So it's a bone conduction.
And now that's really all I'm getting.
There's that confusion between, is it coming from the headphones or is it coming from my ears? I hear crows.
So he's hearing crows that nobody else hears because he's hearing it from microphones that are farther away. But the idea is that we're tracking your head, where do you want to hear things, and then be able to project you out farther in nature that way. We talked to Bose about this. They were very interested, but at the end of the day, they didn't bite on it. This is sort of a different views of the virtual world where you actually see, where you actually fly over the surface and then you can sort of drill down, but there are also synthetic characters, so deer-like characters whose fur responds to the moisture. So if it's raining, their fur gets very heavy. If it's cold, their fur gets so it's sort of a little bit of fantasy thrown in there, but it's also how do you think about the behavior of animals? And we haven't developed that idea because we don't have a really good game designer. But I wanted to just close. I know that my time is sort of up, but I wanted to close to just come back to the notion of Cranberry Farms in Massachusetts, because you're going to be hearing more about this. There are about 13,000 acres of former wetland cranberry farms operational in Massachusetts today. There are about 375 owners of those farms, and they're all facing the same challenge we faced. We just made the decision early. In fact, I thought we might have made it too late when but what you can see is that they dot the landscape. The work of Living Observatory, in part, is to take what we learned and to try to help in these other restoration or protection projects, but help farmers make that decision to conserve as opposed to do solar farms on their land, which is really crazy. I mean, upland maybe, but doing it on the bog surface, really crazy. And we think that for small farms, the farmer might be able themselves to help if we could change regulation just a little bit. So in that way, even if you wound up with some development around the restoration, let's say you had a 20-acre farm, Evan's been very focused on this, on trying to figure out how can we change regulations sufficiently to make those restorations possible in order to get this peatland back into a conserved, restored state. And we don't know yet. We're not there, but Plymouth has sort of signed on to the idea of that. The state of Massachusetts, the Division of Ecological Restoration, now has a Cranberry Bog program. They've partnered with the NRCS, so we're going for a very big grant to try to fund some of the bigger protection farm pieces. So we're working on both of those. We're also continuing to work on getting the results of what we know so far out to the public. We're involved in writing a report for the state. We continue to work with schools sort of internationally. So there's a lot of outreach going on, and I just think that this particular set of we've all seen farms go. You remember the set of Vermont farms that went, and the Massachusetts farms, and you have a lot in this community. Terrific to preserve. I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about the cranberry situation because it's dire. Cranberries are not coming back to Massachusetts because you cannot grow cranberries on wetlands anymore, and shouldn't. You know, they're all grown in very highly dense developed places. So that's all I have for you. If you want to.
Let's have a big hand for
Thank you.
Take a couple of questions if there are any, Bill. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thanks for supporting the Trust.